The village elder saw the dust cloud first. It rose from the east, from the direction of the Qing garrison, getting closer. He had lived 73 years on these grasslands. He had seen armies before. He knew what dust clouds meant. But this was different. The Qing soldiers had come through the valley 3 times already that summer. Each time they burned a village. Each time they killed everyone inside. Men, women, children, no exceptions. The survivors from those villages had run to the mountains. Most of them died anyway, hunted down, shot, left to starve. The elder gathered the village, 80 families, maybe 400 people, Dzunga Mongols who had lived here for generations, herders, farmers, people who had done nothing except exist. Someone asked if they should run. The elder shook his head. Run where? The next valley had already been burned. The valley after that was empty. The mountains were full of Qing patrols hunting, refugees. There was nowhere to go. Someone asked if they should fight. The elder looked at the men, herdsmen with knives, a few old swords, maybe 20 people who knew how to ride and shoot. The dust cloud was getting closer. The Qing soldiers had cannons, muskets, orders. There was no point in fighting. The elder told everyone to gather in the center of the village. He told them to stay together. He told the mothers to hold their children. He did not tell them it would be all right. He could not lie to them. Everyone in the village knew their nation was dying. The year was 1757. The Dzunga Khanate, the nation these people belonged to, had been one of the most powerful empires in Central Asia, a nomadic empire of warriors and horsemen who had fought the Qing dynasty to a standstill for 70 years. 2 years ago, there were 600,000 Dzungas. Now there were maybe 100,000 left, maybe fewer. No one was counting anymore. The Qing Emperor Qianlong had made a decision. The Dzungas would not just be defeated, they would be erased. Every man, every woman, every child. He called it pacification. His generals called it their orders. History would call it genocide. The soldiers carrying out those orders reached the village an hour before sunset. The Qing soldiers did not negotiate. They did not ask questions. They had done this 50 times before. They knew the routine. By the time the sun went down, the village was gone. 80 families, 400 people, added to a number that would eventually reach 600,000, 80% of an entire nation, killed in 3 years. To understand how 80% of a nation, 600,000 people, were erased in 3 years, you have to understand who the Dzungas were and why the most powerful emperor in Asia wanted them dead. 70 years before that village burned, the Dzungas were the most powerful nomadic empire in Asia. They controlled a territory larger than Western Europe. Dzungaria, the heartland, stretched across what is now northern Xinjiang, Western Mongolia, and eastern Kazakhstan. Grasslands that went on forever. Mountains with passes only the Dzungas knew how to navigate. Deserts where armies died of thirst. This was not empty land. This was strategic land. The Silk Road ran through it. Trade routes connecting China to Central Asia to Europe. Whoever controlled these routes controlled wealth. The Dzungas controlled them. They were Oirat Mongols, descendants of the warriors who had ridden with Genghis Khan centuries earlier. They had not forgotten how to fight on horseback, how to move an army across impossible terrain, how to appear where the enemy did not expect them. At their peak, the Dzunga Khanate had maybe 600,000 to 800,000 people, not a huge population, but among them were some of the finest cavalry in the world. Dzunga horsemen could ride for days without rest. They could shoot arrows from a galloping horse and hit targets 100 yards away. They carried multiple horses per man. When one tired, they switched to another. They moved faster than any army trying to chase them. And they had something else: discipline. Nomadic armies had a reputation for being wild, disorganized, effective in raids but useless in prolonged campaigns. The Dzungas were different. They had structure, commanders, supply systems. They could wage long wars, siege cities, hold territory. They were not just raiders. They were an empire. The Qing dynasty, ruling China since 1644, watched the Dzungas and worried. The Qing emperors were Manchus, not ethnic Han Chinese. They had conquered China through superior military organization and ruthless efficiency. They understood power, and they understood that the Dzungars were a threat, not an immediate threat. The Dzungars were not invading China. They were not besieging Beijing, but they were blocking Qing expansion westward. They were raiding Qing territories. They were demonstrating that the Qing Empire had limits. No empire likes limits. In 1687, the Qing Emperor Kangxi sent an army into Dzungar territory. The campaign was a disaster. The Dzungar cavalry harassed the Qing supply lines. They avoided pitched battles. They lured the invaders deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Then they struck when the Qing forces were exhausted and far from reinforcements. The Qing army retreated. Kangxi tried again in 1690, again in 1696. Each time, the result was the same. The Dzungars would not be conquered. The war dragged on for decades. Not continuous fighting. Campaigns followed by years of uneasy peace. Skirmishes along the borders. Diplomatic missions that accomplished nothing. The Qing could not break the Dzungars. The Dzungars could not drive out the Qing. It was a stalemate. This frustrated the Qing emperors beyond measure. They ruled the largest empire in Asia. They had subdued Tibet. They had beaten back Russian expansion in the north. They commanded millions of soldiers, and they could not defeat a few 100,000 nomads on horses. The problem was terrain. Dzungaria was not farmland where you could build supply depots. It was grassland and desert and mountains. A Qing army marching into Dzungar territory needed to carry everything with them: food, water, ammunition. The supply trains stretched for miles. Dzungar cavalry could hit those supply trains and disappear before the Qing soldiers could respond. Cut off the food, and the army starved. Cut off the water, and men died within days. The Dzungars knew their land. The Qing did not. And there was something else. The Dzungars were Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhism. This gave them allies. Tibet supported them politically. Mongolian tribes sympathized with them. They were not isolated. They had a network. The Qing tried to break that network. They pressured Tibet. They bribed Mongolian chiefs. They used diplomacy, threats, money. Some of it worked. Some of it did not. But the Dzungars remained undefeated. In 1735, a new emperor took the throne in Beijing. His name was Qianlong. He was 24 years old. Qianlong inherited an empire at its height, prosperous, stable, strong. His grandfather Kangxi and his father Yongzheng had built a system that worked. The treasury was full. The army was large. The borders were mostly secure, except for one problem: the Dzungars. They were still there, still independent, still a reminder that Qing power had limits. Qianlong was ambitious. He wanted to be remembered as a great emperor, greater than his grandfather, greater than any emperor before him. Great emperors conquered enemies. They expanded borders. They brought glory to the dynasty. The Dzungars were the most obvious enemy to conquer. For the first 20 years of his reign, Qianlong dealt with other priorities: internal reforms, campaigns in the southwest, building projects. He kept an eye on the Dzungars, but did not move against them. He was waiting for an opening. In 1753, he got one. The Dzungar leader, the Kong Taiji, was named Galdan Tseren. He had ruled for 25 years. He was competent, respected. He had maintained Dzungar power and kept the Qing at bay. In 1745, Galdan Tseren died. His death triggered a succession crisis. 3 of his sons claimed the throne. Each had supporters. Each had armed followers. None of them could establish clear authority. The Dzungar Khanate, stable for decades, descended into civil war. Factions fought each other. Alliances shifted. Assassinations. Betrayals. The kind of chaos that tears empires apart from the inside. Qianlong watched this and saw opportunity. A united Dzungar Khanate was dangerous. A divided one was vulnerable. He began preparing for invasion. He gathered intelligence. He sent spies into Dzungar territory to map the land, identify water sources, locate strongholds. He stockpiled supplies along the border. He assembled an army. Not just any army. Qianlong mobilized 50,000 soldiers, Manchu bannermen, Mongolian auxiliaries, Chinese infantry, artillery units, the best troops the empire could field. He put them under the command of a general named Bandi, an experienced officer. a man who understood logistics. The orders were clear. March west. Take advantage of the Dzunga civil war. Occupy key positions. Force the Dzungas to submit. In the spring of 1755, the Qing army crossed into Dzunga territory. They expected resistance. They expected battles. They expected the Dzunga cavalry to harass them like they had for 70 years. None of that happened. The Dzungas were too busy fighting each other. One faction, led by a man named Amusana, actually welcomed the Qing. He saw them as allies. He thought if he helped the Qing defeat his rivals, they would support him as the new Kong Taiji. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. Bandi's army moved through Dzungaria facing almost no opposition. They occupied fortresses. They secured trade routes. They planted the Qing flag in places no Qing soldier had ever reached. By the summer of 1755, the war seemed over. The Dzunga leadership was scattered. Their military was fractured. The Qing controlled the heartland. Qianlong was thrilled. The enemy his grandfather could not defeat had fallen in a single campaign. He had succeeded where Kangxi and Yongzheng had failed. He issued a proclamation. The Dzungas were now subjects of the Qing Empire. They would pay taxes. They would send representatives to Beijing. They would obey Qing law. The crisis was over. The threat was eliminated. Or so he thought. Amusana, the man who had helped the Qing invade, quickly realized he had been used. The Qing were not going to make him the ruler of the Dzungas. They were not going to give him power. They were treating him like a minor nobleman who needed to be kept under control. He had betrayed his own people for nothing. In the fall of 1755, Amusana rebelled. He gathered the remnants of the Dzunga military. He rallied tribes that had submitted to the Qing. He attacked Qing garrisons. He killed Qing officials. The rebellion spread fast. Dzungas who had accepted Qing rule changed their minds. Villages that had surrendered took up arms again. Within months, the Qing occupation collapsed. Bandi's forces were scattered. Qing soldiers were ambushed. Supply lines were cut. The army that had marched triumphantly into Dzungaria in the spring was retreating in chaos by winter. Qianlong was furious. He had declared victory. He had celebrated. He had told the empire that the Dzungas were defeated. Now they were in open revolt and making him look like a fool. He sent orders to Bandi. Crush the rebellion. Do whatever it takes. Bring back control. Bandi tried. He reorganized his forces. He launched counterattacks. He recaptured some territory. But the Dzungas were fighting differently now. They were not just defending themselves. They were fighting for survival. And they were good at it. By early 1756, it was clear the Qing could not win a conventional war. Every time they occupied a region, the Dzungas melted into the countryside and launched guerrilla attacks. Every time they thought they had crushed the resistance, a new leader emerged. The Qing were losing men, losing supplies, losing credibility. Qianlong faced a choice. He could accept a negotiated settlement, withdraw most of his forces, let the Dzungas have some autonomy in exchange for nominal submission. This would save face, end the bleeding, allow both sides to claim some kind of victory. Or he could escalate. He could commit more troops, more resources, more time. He could turn this into a total war. Not just defeat the Dzungas, but destroy them completely. Most emperors would have chosen the first option. Cut your losses. Move on. Qianlong chose the second, but he changed the objective. This would no longer be a war of conquest. It would be a war of elimination. The Dzungas would not just be defeated. They would be erased. Every man, every woman, every child. In the spring of 1756, Qianlong issued new orders to his generals. The orders were explicit. They were documented. They were not hidden or denied. Kill them all. The orders were not subtle. Qianlong did not hide what he wanted. In imperial edicts sent to his generals in 1756 and 1757, he made his intentions clear. The Dzungas were to be exterminated, not defeated, not scattered, exterminated. He used specific language. He told his generals to kill all Dzunga men capable of bearing arms. He told them not to spare the elderly or the young boys who might grow up to fight. He told them that women and children could be enslaved or killed, depending on the circumstances. He framed this as necessity. The Dzungas had rebelled after submitting. They had proven they could not be trusted. They had shown they would resist Qing rule forever. Therefore, they had to cease to exist. These orders were recorded. They were written down in official documents. They were copied and distributed to commanders across the region. The Qing bureaucracy, meticulous about record-keeping, documented everything. This was not a secret policy. It was official policy. Qianlong did not think he was doing something wrong. He thought he was solving a problem that had plagued 3 emperors over 70 years, a problem that drained resources and undermined Qing prestige. The Dzungars would not submit. They would not assimilate. They would not disappear on their own. So he would make them disappear. He assigned the task to a new commander, a general named Zhao Hui. Zhao Hui was not like Bandi. Bandi had been cautious, strategic. He had tried to minimize casualties and win through superior positioning. Zhao Hui was different. He understood what Qianlong wanted, not victory, annihilation. Zhao Hui reorganized the Qing forces in Dzungar territory. He divided them into mobile columns, fast-moving units that could cover ground quickly and strike without warning. He also changed the strategy. Instead of occupying territory and holding it, his forces would sweep through regions systematically, village by village, valley by valley, killing everyone they found. No negotiations, no offers of surrender, no mercy. The columns would move through an area, eliminate the population, and move on. Behind them would be nothing. No survivors to rebuild. No one to resist. It was efficient. It was methodical. It was exactly what Qianlong wanted. The killing began in earnest in the summer of 1756. Qing columns fanned out across Dzungaria. They followed intelligence reports. Spies and collaborators told them where Dzungar groups were hiding, which valleys still had villages, where refugees had fled. The soldiers followed the information. They marched into the valleys. They surrounded the villages. They did what they had been ordered to do. The pattern repeated across the region. A column would arrive. The Dzungars would see them coming. Some tried to run. Some tried to fight. Most just waited. Running rarely worked. The Qing cavalry could chase down refugees. The terrain that had once protected the Dzungars now trapped them. The mountain passes they knew so well became dead ends when soldiers blocked the exits. Fighting was pointless. A village of herders with hunting weapons could not stop trained soldiers with cannons and muskets. So, most people just waited, like the elder in 1757, like the 80 families who gathered in the center of their village. They waited for the soldiers to arrive, and then they died. The Qing soldiers carried out their orders without hesitation. This was war. They were following imperial commands. Their job was not to question. Their job was to obey. Some commanders were more brutal than others. Some killed quickly. Some took their time. Some enslaved the women and children before killing them later. Some killed everyone, immediately. The result was the same. By the end of 1756, tens of thousands of Dzungars were dead. But tens of thousands were not enough. There were still hundreds of thousands left, scattered across a vast territory, hidden in mountains and forests, fled to neighboring regions. Qianlong was impatient. The killing was taking too long. In 1757, he issued new orders: expand the campaign, send more troops, increase the pace. He also introduced a new tactic, one that would prove devastatingly effective: biological warfare. Smallpox had always been a problem in Central Asia. The disease swept through populations periodically. It killed quickly. It spread easily. Once an outbreak started, it was almost impossible to stop. The Qing had experience with smallpox. They had seen what it could do. They had watched it destroy communities. Now they decided to use it as a weapon. The historical records are careful about how they describe this. They do not always say explicitly that the Qing deliberately spread smallpox to the Dzungars. The language is cautious, vague, but the pattern is clear. Qing forces began distributing infected blankets and clothing to Dzungar populations. They gave them to refugees. They left them in abandoned villages where survivors might return. They handed them out as gifts during brief periods when they pretended to negotiate. The infected materials carried the virus. When Dzungars used the blankets or wore the clothing, they contracted the disease. Then the disease spread. A single infected person could infect dozens more. Those dozens infected hundreds. The virus moved through refugee camps and hidden villages faster than any army could. Within months, Smallpox was sweeping through the remaining Dzunga population. People who had survived the soldiers died of disease. Entire families were wiped out. Communities that had hidden successfully in the mountains died without ever seeing a Qing soldier. The disease did not distinguish. It killed warriors and children, the healthy and the weak, leaders and followers. The Qing officers documented the effectiveness of this tactic. They reported that the disease was killing Dzungas in regions the army had not even reached yet, that the virus was doing what soldiers alone could not. Qianlong approved. This was exactly the kind of efficiency he wanted. By the end of 1757, the Dzunga population was collapsing. The military campaigns had killed many. The disease had killed more. The combination was devastating, but the Qing were not finished. Zhao Hui implemented a scorched earth policy. His troops were ordered to destroy everything that could sustain life in Dzunga territories. They burned crops. They slaughtered livestock. They poisoned wells and water sources. They destroyed food stores and supplies. The goal was simple. Even if some Dzungas survived the soldiers and the disease, they would die of starvation. The policy worked. Winter in Central Asia is harsh. Temperatures drop, far below freezing. Snow covers the grasslands. Animals die if they are not sheltered and fed. People die too. The Dzungas who had fled into the mountains and forests faced winter with no food, no shelter, no supplies. The Qing had destroyed everything. Some tried to hunt, but game was scarce, and Qing patrols were hunting the hunters. Some tried to survive on whatever they could forage, roots, bark, anything edible. It was not enough. Thousands died of starvation during the winter of 1757-1758. Slowly, painfully, watching their children die first. Those who survived the winter emerged weak, sick, desperate. Many tried to surrender. They walked to Qing garrisons and offered to submit. They begged for food, for mercy. Some were enslaved. Some were killed immediately. Some were given false promises of safety and then killed later. Very few survived. By the spring of 1758, the Dzunga Khanate no longer existed as a functioning society. There were still Dzungas alive, scattered groups, hiding in remote areas, individuals who had managed to escape to neighboring territories, a few thousand who had been enslaved by the Qing, but as a people, as a nation, they were gone. The population that had numbered 600,000 to 800,000 in 1755 was now maybe 100,000, maybe fewer. 80% were dead. In 3 years, the territory they had controlled was empty. The villages were burned. The grazing lands were abandoned. The trade routes were silent. Qianlong had achieved what 3 emperors before him could not. He had eliminated the Dzunga threat, not by defeating them, by erasing them. The orders he had issued in 1756 had been carried out completely. The soldiers had done their jobs. The disease had done its work. The starvation had finished what was left. In Beijing, Qianlong received reports of the success. He was pleased. The problem was solved. The empire was secure. The western frontier was pacified. He ordered celebrations. He commissioned poems about the great victory. He had artists create paintings showing the conquest of the West. He never used the word genocide. He used words like pacification, subjugation, necessary measures. But the Qing records documented what had actually happened. The orders, the methods, the numbers. They knew. They just did not call it what it was. But the campaign was not finished. As long as survivors existed anywhere, they could rebuild. They could return. Qianlong would not allow that. The Qing called them remnants. The Dzungas who survived the campaigns of 1756 and 1757 were scattered across thousands of miles. Some had fled into the Altai Mountains to the north. Some had crossed into Russian territory. Some had disappeared into the deserts to the south. They were not an army anymore. They were refugees, families, individuals, people running for their lives. The Qing hunted them anyway. In 1758, Qianlong issued orders to pursue the survivors. He was not satisfied with destroying the Dzunga heartland. He wanted complete extermination. As long as Dzungas existed anywhere, they could rebuild. They could return. They could become a problem again. That could not be allowed. Qing forces were reorganized into pursuit units. Smaller groups, mobile. Their job was not to hold territory. Their job was to track down survivors and kill them. The units spread out across the frontier regions. They followed trails. They questioned locals. They offered rewards for information about Dzunga hiding places. Many people took the rewards. Neighboring tribes who had grievances with the Dzungas. Merchants who wanted to stay on the Qing's good side. Desperate individuals who needed money. The information poured in. This valley has a group of refugees. That mountain pass is being used by survivors. A family is hiding in a cave near that river. The pursuit units followed every lead. When they found survivors, the orders were simple. Kill them. Age did not matter. 70-year-old man hiding in the mountains was killed. A 10-year-old boy traveling with his mother was killed. Wounded soldiers who could barely walk were killed. No exceptions. Some survivors tried to surrender. They approached Qing patrols with empty hands. They offered to work. They begged for their children's lives. Most were killed immediately. A few were taken as slaves. Very few were allowed to live as free people. The Qing did not want Dzunga slaves either. Slaves could rebel. Slaves could remember their past. Slaves could teach their children who they really were. Better to eliminate them. The pursuit continued through 1758 and into 1759. Groups of survivors were found hiding in caves. They had lived there for months, eating whatever they could find, drinking from streams, trying to stay hidden. The Qing soldiers smoked them out, set fires at the cave entrances. The refugees had two choices: stay inside and suffocate, or come out and be killed. Most stayed inside. Other groups tried to keep moving. They traveled at night, avoided roads, stayed away from settlements. They thought if they could just keep moving, they might eventually reach safety. There was no safety. Qing patrols were everywhere. The network of informants was everywhere. Even in remote regions far from Dzungaria, survivors were being tracked down. A Dzunga family might make it 200 miles into Mongol territory. They would think they had escaped. Then soldiers would arrive. Someone had reported them. The family would be killed. This happened again and again across Central Asia. Survivors scattered in every direction. Qing forces followed in every direction. It was systematic, methodical, thorough. The Qing were not just winning a war. They were erasing a people from existence. Some Dzungas made it to Russian territory. Russia and the Qing Empire shared a border. A long, poorly defined border. Russians and Qing officials had been negotiating over it for decades. In theory, refugees who crossed into Russian territory were safe. The Qing could not pursue them there without violating Russian sovereignty. In practice, the situation was more complicated. Some Russian officials gave sanctuary to Dzunga refugees. They saw them as potential allies, or they simply felt it was the right thing to do. Other Russian officials handed the refugees back to the Qing. They did not want to antagonize the powerful empire to the south over a few thousand refugees. The Qing sent diplomatic missions to Russia. They demanded the return of all Dzunga refugees. They offered trade concessions. They made threats. Russia was not unified in its response. Different regions handled refugees differently. Some were protected. Some were returned. Those who were returned were killed. The Russians knew this. The diplomatic correspondence makes it clear. Russian officials understood that handing over Dzunga refugees meant sending them to their deaths. Some protested. Some refused to cooperate. But Russia as a whole did not take a strong stand. Thousands of Dzungars who had made it to Russian territory were eventually returned to Qing forces. They died just like the ones who had stayed in Dzungaria. By late 1758, the pursuit was winding down. Not because the Qing decided to stop, because there were almost no Dzungas left to hunt. The military campaigns had killed hundreds of thousands. The smallpox epidemic had killed tens of thousands more. Starvation had killed thousands. The pursuit units had hunted down most of the survivors. What remained was a scattered handful, a few families in remote locations, individuals who had successfully hidden their identities, a small number who had been enslaved and might survive. The population that had been 600,000 to 800,000 in 1755 was now estimated at somewhere between 50,000 and 120,000. The estimates vary because there was no accurate count. The Qing were not interested in counting survivors. They were interested in making sure there were as few as possible, 80% dead, possibly more. In terms of percentage of population killed, this was one of the most complete genocides in human history. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia killed about 25% of the population. The Rwandan genocide killed about 70% of the Tutsi population. The Holocaust killed about 60% of European Jews. The Dzungar genocide killed 80% in 3 years. And it was not accidental. It was not collateral damage from a war. It was deliberate, planned, documented. Qianlong's orders were explicit. His generals carried them out completely. The Qing bureaucracy recorded everything. This was not a secret genocide. It was an official policy. The few Dzungars who survived faced a different kind of death, cultural death. The Qing banned the use of the Dzungar language. They destroyed Dzungar historical records. They burned Buddhist texts, written in Dzungar. They tore down monuments and temples. Any visible reminder of Dzungar culture was eliminated. The survivors were scattered, separated from each other, forbidden to gather, forbidden to practice their religion openly, forbidden to teach their children their history. Within a generation, many young Dzungars did not speak their native language. They did not know their own history. They did not identify as Dzungar. They had been assimilated, absorbed, erased. Some families preserved their identity in secret. They whispered stories to their children. They remembered the old songs. They kept the language alive in hidden spaces. But these families were rare. Most survivors simply disappeared into the larger population. They became Mongols, or Uyghurs, or Han Chinese, anything except Dzungar. Because being Dzungar was too dangerous. It marked you as a target. It meant you were one of the people the empire had tried to eliminate. Better to forget. Better to become someone else. By 1760, the Dzungar Khanate was gone. Not just defeated, not just conquered, gone. The territory was reorganized as Xinjiang province. The name meant new frontier. New, because the old inhabitants were dead. Frontier because it was now the edge of the Qing Empire. The Qing brought in settlers, Han Chinese farmers, Manchu soldiers who were given land grants, Uyghur merchants, other ethnic groups willing to populate the empty grasslands. These settlers did not know what had happened, or if they knew, they did not talk about it. They moved into villages that had been emptied. They used grazing lands where Dzungar herds had once roamed. They built lives on top of mass graves. The new settlers were told this was virgin territory, empty land waiting to be developed, a frontier opportunity. No one mentioned the 600,000 people who had lived here 3 years earlier. No one talked about the villages that had been burned, the bodies that had been left to rot, the systematic campaign to erase an entire nation. That was not part of the official story. The official story was simple. The Qing Empire had pacified a rebellious region. Order had been restored. The emperor's authority extended to the western frontier. Civilization had triumphed over barbarism. That was what the histories would say. That was what the poems celebrated. That was what future generations would be taught. The truth was buried with the bodies. Qianlong commissioned a series of paintings to commemorate his victories. Large detailed works showing Qing soldiers accepting the surrender of various tribal leaders, peaceful scenes, orderly transitions of power. No paintings showed the reality. No artist depicted the burning villages, the smallpox victims, the refugees being hunted down, the children dying of starvation. That was not how emperors wanted to be remembered. In 1759, Qianlong declared the campaign complete. He held celebrations in Beijing. He gave honors to his generals. He distributed rewards to the soldiers who had carried out his orders. He never expressed regret. He never questioned the morality of what had been done. He saw this as one of his greatest achievements. He had succeeded where 3 emperors had failed. He had eliminated the Dzungar threat permanently. He had expanded the empire. He had secured the frontier. In his mind, he was a successful emperor, a strong emperor, an emperor who did what was necessary. History would judge him differently, but that would come much later. For now, the Dzungars were gone. The land had been emptied and refilled. The records had been sanitized. The story had been rewritten, and very few people outside the region even noticed. The final count was never precise. Qing records documented military victories. They recorded the number of enemy combatants killed in specific battles. They tracked the number of people enslaved or relocated. But they did not produce a comprehensive death toll. There was no official report that said, "We killed X number of Dzungars." The numbers had to be reconstructed later by historians, by demographers, by people trying to piece together what had happened from fragmentary evidence. The estimates vary. The Dzungar population, before the genocide, was somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000. After the genocide, somewhere between 50,000 and 120,000 remained. At minimum, 500,000 dead. At maximum, 700,000. The most commonly cited figure is 600,000. 80% of the population, gone in 3 years. By 1800, just 40 years after the genocide, almost no one identified as Dzungar anymore. The name itself was disappearing. The language died. By the mid-19th century, there were almost no native speakers left. A few scholars had recorded some vocabulary. A few Buddhist texts survived. But as a living language, it was gone. The culture died. The songs, the stories, the traditions, the way of life that had existed for centuries, all of it vanished. The Dzungars had been Buddhists. Their monasteries were destroyed. Their lamas were killed or forced to flee. The religious texts written in their language were burned. Some of these texts were unique, translations of Buddhist scriptures that existed nowhere else, commentaries written by Dzungar scholars, historical records of their own people, all destroyed. The physical landscape changed. The Qing renamed cities and rivers and mountains. The old Dzungar place names were replaced with Chinese ones. Within a generation, the maps showed no trace of the people who had lived there. Travelers passing through Xinjiang in the early 1800s wrote about empty grasslands, abandoned settlements, ruins with no explanation for why they were ruined. No one talked about genocide. That word did not exist yet in any language. It would not be coined until 1944 by a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin in response to the Holocaust. But even without the word, the reality was clear. The Dzungars had been systematically exterminated, and then they were forgotten. This forgetting was not accidental. It was the final stage of the genocide. By the late 1800s, Western scholars studying Central Asian history knew almost nothing about the Dzungars. Some mentioned them briefly. A footnote, a minor nomadic group that had once controlled some territory. The scale of what had happened to them was unknown. The deliberate nature of their extermination was unknown. The documents existed in Qing archives, but no one was looking for them. China itself did not teach this history. The official narrative was that Xinjiang had been integrated into the empire through standard military campaigns. Rebellious elements had been suppressed. Order had been established. Even today, this remains one of the least known genocides in history. Ask a random person about historical genocides, and they will mention the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, Rwanda, Cambodia, possibly the Native American genocides. Almost no one mentions the Dzungars. There are reasons for this. The genocide happened in a remote region. Central Asia in the 1750s was far from the centers of European power. No Western journalists witnessed it. No diplomats reported it. No missionaries wrote letters home describing the horrors. It happened to a people with no descendants to remember them. Unlike other genocides where survivor communities kept the memory alive, the Dzungars were so thoroughly destroyed that there was almost no one left to tell the story. It happened before the modern human rights framework existed, before the concept of crimes against humanity, before international law recognized genocide as a distinct category of evil. The Qing records documented what happened, but those records stayed in Chinese archives. They were not translated. They were not widely studied. They were not accessible to international scholars until the 20th century. And when scholars finally did examine them, the genocide was already 200 years in the past. There were no living witnesses, no physical evidence beyond ruins, no living culture to mourn its own destruction. The forgetting was complete. Modern China does not emphasize this history. Xinjiang today is a politically sensitive region. The government does not want to discuss the violent origins of Chinese control there. The Uyghur population in Xinjiang today knows fragments of the story. They know the Dzungars existed. They know they were destroyed. But the details are not taught in schools. The full scope of the genocide is not acknowledged. Some historians in China have studied the Dzunga genocide. They have published papers. They have analyzed the Qing records. They have documented the numbers and the methods. But this research does not reach a wide audience. It remains academic, specialized, known to experts but not to the general public. Outside China, the situation is similar. A handful of specialists know the history. They have written books and articles. They have tried to bring attention to what happened. But the Dzunga genocide remains obscure, overshadowed, forgotten by most of the world. This is what successful genocide looks like, not just killing the people, killing their memory, making sure no one remembers they existed, making sure their destruction leaves no mark on history. Qianlong achieved this, and most of the world has never heard of them. In 2004, a group of scholars held a conference on the Dzunga genocide. It was the first major academic gathering focused specifically on what had happened. 250 years after the events, the conference produced papers, books, renewed attention from historians, an acknowledgement that this was indeed genocide, and that it deserved to be studied and remembered. But renewed attention among scholars is not the same as public memory. It is not commemorated with memorials or museums. There is no international day of remembrance. The Dzungas are still forgotten. In Xinjiang today, there are ruins, scattered across the grasslands and mountains, remnants of fortifications, foundations of buildings, burial sites. Most of these ruins are unmarked. No plaques explaining what they are. No signs identifying them as Dzungar. They are just anonymous stone and earth slowly being reclaimed by the landscape. A traveller might walk past them and not know 600,000 people died here, that an entire nation was erased here, that this empty land was once full of life. The forgetting is built into the landscape itself. Qianlong died in 1799. He was 88 years old. He had ruled for 60 years, longer than almost any emperor in Chinese history. He was remembered as one of the greatest Qing emperors, a patron of the arts, a military genius, a wise administrator, the emperor who expanded the empire to its greatest extent. The genocide of the Dzungas was listed among his achievements, one of his 10 great campaigns, a successful military operation, nothing more. He never expressed regret. Neither did his successors, neither did the historians who wrote the official histories. The Dzungas simply became a footnote, a minor obstacle that had been overcome, a problem that had been solved. And that is how they remain. The village elder who watched the dust cloud approach in 1757 was right. His nation was dying. He knew it. Everyone in that village knew it. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that their deaths would be forgotten, that within a few generations, almost no one would remember they had existed, that the land their ancestors had lived on for centuries would be renamed and repopulated as if they had never been there. They died, and then they were erased. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Did you know about the Dzungars before today? 600,000 people killed and the world forgot. Does that feel right to you? Should 600,000 deaths just disappear from history? Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more stories like this.